I'm honored to welcome Parker Conrad to the stage. His insights are not just a window into the age of AI, but also a beacon to the next generation of entrepreneurs and professionals. Please, Parker, join me. You had a string of startups that you've been involved in, and you had challenges in growth to get to Rippling. Tell us a brief story of your first startup and where you are today and that journey.
So my first startup, I was working at a job at a pharmaceutical company down in Southern California. And my career was sort of moving like somewhat slowly. And my roommate from college came to me and said, hey, look, would you like to start a company? And I thought, man, I'll be an old man kicking myself if Mike goes and does this and it's successful and I don't. And so I said, sure. And then we decided we want to start. We did exactly the wrong thing. We said, let's start a company, and then we started looking around thinking, well, what company should we start? Which is absolutely the worst way to do it. And we settled on an idea that sounded really good, but that was actually terrible. And we spent 7 years of slow, grinding failure, often 2 months away from missing payroll. Sort of always convinced that we were sort of 6 months away from really cracking something and making it work. And eventually, I ended up leaving the company after 7 years. Mike is actually still there. The company is still around. When I left that first company, so I often tell people that when people come to me sometimes and they want to start a business and ask for my advice is usually don't do it. And I sort of talk them through all the reasons why it's a terrible idea. And I understand this is an organization for entrepreneurs. And so I feel safe telling you guys this because I also know that no one ever listens to my advice about this. And if anything, talking about why it's such a terrible idea has only encouraged people to keep going. But my first company I started because I was too naive to understand what I was really getting into. And sort of how hard and difficult it would be. And then the second company, when I left SigFig, I had been at this company for 7 years, and I started looking around for what I was going to do next. I did not want to start a company, and it was really hard because I wasn't really qualified for any particular jobs. It was sort of I'd been doing this amorphous thing for 7 years. Was it like I wasn't really qualified to, run a sales organization or do marketing and so it sort of after looking around for a little bit, I realized that the only thing I was really qualified to do was to try and start another company and have a go at this. And so at my first company, I had spent a lot of time, we never had any money to hire anyone in HR or anything like that. So we had spent all this time, I ran payroll and did benefits, and every time someone started at the company, I had to stop off at Kinko's and fax in their insurance application because that was the way that you did that back then. And I thought, man, all this stuff should be online. It should all work together. You should just click a button and everything should work. And that really became the sort of genesis of Zenefits. And Zenefits was the exact opposite of my first company. My first company, we went out and tried to raise money from 70 different VCs over the course of 2 years. Everyone told us no. It was impossible to raise money. And when we were trying to fundraise, VCs would come to us and they would sort of say, is there like a social local mobile element to this, or what's your Facebook app strategy? And there was sort of a different thing every 6 months, and these were kind of like the Web3, the generative AI of like that time, of sort of 2009 and 2010. And I sort of thought, man, investors always want to invest in these fads, and it just takes too long, to build a business in one of these areas to capture their attention. So I sort of said, I'm going to give up on being able to raise money. I'm going to try and build a business that produces a lot of revenue. Hopefully I won't need to raise money. And it turns out those were exactly the kinds of businesses that VCs wanted to invest in. And so at Zenefits, everything worked for us. And we raised, as many of you guys know, an enormous amount of money and grew extremely quickly and had a lot of commercial success. And then everything kind of came crashing down. And so my second company, I started because I felt like I had no other choices. And then by the time of my third company, I think I was so sort of bent on, that if I started this particular business and grew it into something really big, that would force some kind of reassessment or reevaluation, that there was a redemption story that I wanted. And that was what, the only way that I could kind of get there was building this specific business. And so the third company I started, just because I think at that point I was just purely kind of completely mentally disturbed about this stuff. And so I'm very hopeful that I will never start a fourth. That's my goal.
So tell me, lessons learned from Zenefits to Rippling, because similar model, but more AI-driven, probably more energy, more different direction. Lessons learned and things you did differently when you came on to Rippling.
Well, so there are some really specific things that we did differently at Rippling, and I think mostly these are unrelated to most of the headlines around Zenefits, and I think that the thing that really kind of made that company not work is that we sort of noticed early on. I noticed really early on that we were almost too successful top of funnel. So, Zain works in the insurance industry, and one of the things we found is that actually everything that we tried to do to get clients to make us our broker was working really well. And revenue was growing so quickly that we thought the problem here is actually that, there's too much opportunity here in this market that we've discovered. And there are going to be these fast followers that sort of come up, maybe in different parts of the country. And if we can't take all the oxygen out of the room, who knows, whether we're even the ones that end up winning at the end of the day, or someone else who's a little more willing to sort of, push the pedal all the way to the floor ends up sort of winning the market. And so I made a very conscious decision that we were going to scale the company ahead of our underlying engineering capabilities. And so we said, look, businesses have all this administrative work that's related to dealing with all these different systems that didn't really tie together, whether it was enrollment for insurance or setting up retirement plans with 401k or payroll or offer letters or any number of other things related to HR. And we're going to just take on that administrative work for them. We'll do it. We'll have a bunch of people that will kind of, sort of do, kind of making sure that things work for our clients. And we'll build software to automate that over time. What happened is it turns out that things scaled so quickly, and it's actually very hard to automate things when they're scaling fast, and particularly as they get really scaled. And so it made the automation take longer. It was harder to build. And because we were doing things manually, there was always kind of this error rate around the things we were doing for clients that led to this conventional wisdom among our client base that the idea behind Zenefits is great, but there's some execution challenges. Our experience was a little bit so-so. And so the thing that we did very differently at Rippling is we took a lot longer to launch the product. We took about 2 years just building software. And for a while, the company was me and about 40 engineers, and not much else than that. But we built everything that was sort of software end-to-end, which meant it worked really flawlessly. Not that we never have issues, but it was, there weren't sort of systemic, unsolvable problems like that. And that was the really big difference. And it was a long time, we were really religious about this for a while. I mean, we didn't have anyone that we hired in customer support until we were about $5 million in revenue, because I was sort of convinced that we needed to make sure that engineers were doing support, I was doing support. We were going to do that until like, until it was absolutely not possible anymore. And so that was like the biggest difference, I think, between the two companies.
Fantastic. The concept of compound startup versus point solution is fascinating. What are your thoughts on, because compound solution is what Rippling, I think, is. So tell me about that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, look, I think we've been building software wrong for 20 years. Because for 20 years now, the conventional wisdom has been that the way to build great products is to build something extremely narrow. And it's led to this problem for buyers, which is that companies end up with 100 different pieces of SaaS software. And that is, I'm convinced, the underlying reason for a lot of just the administrative work of running a business. And there are a lot of great businesses that you can build in that way, but I think what's been overlooked is that the biggest opportunities in business software specifically are going to be companies that can build a suite of products that interoperate seamlessly, that solve a deeper set of challenges for customers that often span a lot of different sort of point solutions. And for a lot of reasons, I think those end up being bigger commercial outcomes, and you can build much better products for customers, which is somewhat counterintuitive. And you can build better products because the integration enables a lot of product capabilities that aren't possible if you're building sort of isolated, individual solutions. But also because it allows you to invest in some like really key capabilities that, you look across the pantheon of business software, and every company has to build some concept of like, their customers end up asking them for reports. And so they sort of tack on like a reporting module with, maybe an ability to download a CSV, and you got to build authentication and permissions. And so you have some rough concept of that. And when you're building the way that we build, you can go really deep on those concepts. So when at Rippling, when we build reports, we're trying to compete with, Tableau and dbt and systems like that in terms of what are the underlying analytics capabilities of this system. And we can go really deep on permissions and workflow automations and approvals, and then reuse that stuff across all of the products that we build, which I think allows us to build products that are much better, even as we're building sort of many of them in parallel. And so that's the sort of, I think that I sometimes talk about it as like a really thick platform layer and a really thin application layer as the sort of architecture of the system. And I think ultimately the key advantage that Rippling has from a technology perspective.
Fantastic. This audience, I'm sure there's 80% people in the room, successful entrepreneurs, CEOs, et cetera, all doing fundraising. And there are challenges, and it's crucial, correct? Fundraising is a critical part of any startup. Yeah. Tell me, because you've done multiple stages of fundraising in all your companies. Tell us the challenges and the pitfalls and how did you navigate that landscape?
So, what's strange is, I've had a bunch of success raising a lot of capital, but I don't think of myself as fundamentally very, very good at fundraising. And I'd much rather people think, well, man, he's really good at building businesses, rather than being good at fundraising. The only thing that I think is important for fundraising, when people ask me about fundraising, my advice is almost always that instead of trying to be good at fundraising, you should probably focus on just building a good business, or spend more time building a great business. Because the only thing that works is to be so good that they can't afford to ignore you. And that's really the secret to fundraising, is to make the business so incredible that fundraising is going to be easy. And there's some rounding error of additional sort of tricks and tips and tactics that are almost always immaterial. And so my advice is like, look, when you're at a point in the company's journey that you're getting, emails from investors, cold emails from investors that they're, emailing you term sheets with a blank left in for the valuations that's signed and saying, fill in the number you want and send it back to us, that's when it's time to go out and start fundraising. And until you're certain that the underlying business metrics kind of justify, that, it's probably going to be a hard road to hoe. And I've seen it both ways because, I've gone out and tried to make fundraising happen when the business didn't justify it and was impossible, and then seen it the other way where rounds come together very quickly.
So, this conference is all about AI. And as you know, AI is going to change everything. Everybody in this room is going to be jobless, homeless, and we'll all be sitting on the street. But what's your take on it? In reality, how do you see AI, and how have you applied it on Rippling currently? And where do you see the future of AI?
Well, I think earlier the speaker earlier said that the people in AI were divided into two camps. There were the people who couldn't talk about what they're doing, and the people who didn't know what they're doing. And I'm probably in the latter half, to be totally honest. I think I'm probably a lot more optimistic about the possibilities. There are a couple key sort of points of view or opinions that I have on this, and one of them is that I would encourage people that are building companies that have an AI component. It's absolutely clear that because there are a lot of things that are possible with AI that weren't possible before, there are going to be some enormous companies that are built because that new capability is a wedge into a market somewhere that makes things possible that weren't before. But I would encourage you to talk about your company and think about your company without using the words AI. If you can talk about the product that you're building and the problem that you're solving without talking about AI, and talk about just what's the problem you're solving for customers. Think about it as if you were building a company that was using React, like the front-end MVC framework that Facebook built. And you would never talk about how we're a React company. You would just, of course, yeah, that's a tool that you're using. And AI is only going to be valuable to businesses to the extent that you're focused on the sort of end user problem and the customer problem. So that's the first thing that I think is very important. And so at Rippling, there are a bunch of places where we're using AI and we're working on AI projects, but we've really tried hard. I've tried hard not to sort of make announcements like we're pivoting to AI, which I sort of always kind of roll my eyes when other businesses do that. The second element of it is I think that the most interesting use cases for AI, I think that the chat interface is a bug, not a feature for a lot of these products, particularly in B2B software, and that businesses are a little too focused on adding chat interfaces to their products. And I just don't think anyone wants to chat with their HR software. But there are many places where there's unstructured data that you can then pull insights out of that. You can summarize. You can start to build structured features out of unstructured data that you can then use in other ways. That stuff is really revolutionary across a lot of B2B software, even if the interface doesn't look like chat, and even if the customer isn't like totally aware that this is a language model or AI capabilities behind the scenes.
Fantastic. And lastly, Vikram Malhotra's book, CEO Excellence, co-author. On his note, I'll end asking you, CEO or not CEO, how does one distinguish who should be a CEO or who should not?
I think that the most important job. Well, I'll tell you the thing that I think that I do that's most important at Rippling, which is to really set the pace of execution of the business. What I found in companies is that the speed at which businesses move and the output and the productivity of teams is so highly variable across companies. Like you see businesses where the same basic setup, the same basic resources, there are some organizations that just, accomplish not like 20% more because they're working harder, but orders of magnitude more than sort of another group of people that manage to sort of not really get something done. And so I think that people are just are often capable of so much more than they believe themselves to be capable of. And there are very few constituencies in a company for speed. Most people within the organization, they can make the math work by moving more slowly. They want to do a better job. They want to they can sort of solve for everything if the deadlines push. And as the CEO, you're really the only constituency for moving more quickly and for keeping up the pace of execution. And so that I think is one of the most important things that you can bring to the table, as a founder CEO, is to insist on that pace of execution.
Well, thank you, Conrad. And we're under time, as in the cricket, they say 1 hour left. I've got 4 minutes. Is that the time for questions and answers? Or do we have more time? Can somebody tell us? All right, so we'll open it to the floor if anybody has any questions. Yes, can somebody give the gentleman a mic?
Conrad, good stuff. I really appreciate what you talked about here. Quick question. So we all know we're talking about AI, and we know everybody knows one word, ChatGPT, right? And I was just reading a recent article on ChatGPT and how they just turn on one feature, and it basically takes off 12 startups. Do you have anything to say about that, like your company, how they're doing HR stuff, how ChatGPT could do just one thing, changes the entire framework for your company?
I think the challenge that systems like that will have vis-a-vis Rippling and other core business systems is that they don't have the underlying data, and so the most interesting use cases of AI in HR, in my view, are going to be the ones that take advantage of the context window that these systems have, and how context windows are growing very quickly. Because when you run a company, one of the things that happens is when you're 20 people, you know everything that's going on. You know what everyone's working on, what everyone's doing, who's good, who's bad, and then suddenly the business is 200 people, and you have to operate through these levels of abstraction. And you get to a point where Rippling's now 2,400 people, and I have a one-on-one with my CTO, and I'm hoping that something about our conversation eventually leads sort of an engineer somewhere in the company to make a different decision 2 months from now. And the reason that you have to do that is because, as our own context windows are not large enough. Like I have no idea, I can't know what every individual person in the business is working on. But I think one of the really powerful things about AI is this idea that it could allow CEOs and executives to run 200-person companies more like they were 20-person companies, and 2,000-person companies more like they were 200-person companies. Because you have a system that understands what everyone's job and role and function is. That understands this person's an engineer and they're a level 7 engineer, and can sort of see all of their pull requests in GitHub and all of their Slack messages and everything that's happening in Jira, and then can tell me sort of summarize in my one-on-one what's looking across all the one-on-one notes for everyone in the company, understanding everyone's level and job and role and function, and understanding the work product for all of these different teams, can summarize for me what are the key things that are blocking people in the organization, where are people making really rapid progress, where do things appear to be sort of really sclerotic within the organization. But the value of that really depends on having all of that underlying data and across many different systems, and having it joined together in a way that there's a schema that makes sense, where you can understand all of these interrelated pieces about the organization before the language model can really read it and then sort of start to sort of construct features that you can use in other systems.
One last question. We're running out of time, but we'll take one last question and close it.
So that was a great point, Parker, you made about CEO setting the pace of execution. And the point that you mentioned that it can be many times faster, not just incremental 20% or so. How would that be different when you are a startup of, let's say, 50 people versus 2,000 people, right? How would you maintain that pace of execution with that bigger team, and how do you kind of keep everybody come along with that?
I think that one of there are a few ways. Like one thing that happens. I mean, so this is very tactical advice, but a lot of times what happens as a CEO or as an executive is people will come to you and they will say, you can have, we need to choose between A and B. You can have like A or B. And usually it's like, well, we can build this thing on that timeline, or we can have high quality, and you need to decide one or the other. Or we can build this thing or that thing, but not both. And my reaction to that is always viscerally, why do I have to choose? Like, why can't, I call it CEO in a box. And what's happening in situations like that is someone on your team has made a decision for you that those two things are not going to happen together. And they're sort of giving you the illusion of a decision around that they're forcing on you. And so my reaction to that is usually, well, why can't we have A and B? Does this violate the second law of thermodynamics if we have A and B? Like what's like the fundamental reason? And often if you're asking people to find a path to do both of those things, you're asking them for a different path. You're asking for creative solutions, or you're asking them to stretch a little bit, and often like teams will find ways to accomplish things that seemed not possible to them. And the thing about doing a startup is it's somewhere between completely impossible and very, 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 very hard. And between those two extremes, there's such a narrow beam of light that can make it through, that the companies that succeed often find ways of doing the impossible at multiple points along their journey. And so you kind of have to ask that of your team to have a chance of succeeding.
Well, thank you, Parker.
Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure. And I'll raise it up to you.